They lived forever, and that was their first mistake. The universe had taught them patience, so deep it resembled wisdom. Stars were born and died beneath their gaze. Civilizations rose, peaked, and vanished, while they remained unchanged, watching history like a slow-moving tide. To them, time was not a threat. It was a companion, a gentle, endless thing. Humanity was not. Humans burned through their lives the way stars burned through fuel. Brief, violent, luminous. Every heartbeat mattered. Every year was precious. Every mistake was permanent. And in that fragile urgency, something dangerous had evolved. The Immortals did not notice at first. They saw humans as noise in the cosmic background, temporary, emotional, chaotic, a species that lived too fast to ever matter. They assumed eternity would outlast ambition. They assumed patience would always defeat desperation. They were wrong. Much later, after fleets had fallen silent, after ancient beings knelt beneath the weight of chains they never imagined, some of the Immortals would finally understand the truth. Mortality was not a weakness, it was pressure, and pressure creates diamonds, or weapons. By the time they realized that fear sharpens intelligence, that grief accelerates innovation, that a short life forces adaptation at terrifying speed, it was already too late. The children of time had grown up, and the universe would never move slowly again. I remember the moment humanity first saw the Thal'kyr. Not as an explosion, not as an invasion, but as silence. Their ships entered the solar system without urgency, without warning alarms, without any trace of aggression. They drifted, vast, impossible shapes moving with the calm inevitability of continental drift. Living structures grown rather than constructed, composed of translucent bone and crystalline tissue, threaded with soft blue bioluminescent veins that pulsed like the heartbeat of something ancient and alive. Against the black of space, they looked unreal, like ghosts of extinct gods. Human instruments struggled to interpret them. Mass readings fluctuated, energy signatures contradicted known physics. The ships did not burn fuel, they did not accelerate sharply, they simply arrived, as though they had always been meant to be there. Humanity watched in collective stillness. In orbital stations and planetary command centers, people stood frozen before glass walls and holographic projections. Soldiers forgot their training. Scientists forgot to breathe. For a brief, fragile moment, fear was replaced by awe, the kind that humbles a species into believing it has finally met something wiser than itself. The Thal'kyr emerged slowly. They were tall, slender beings, their forms faintly translucent, as if light passed through layers of living marble. Beneath their smooth skin, luminous veins traced calm geometric patterns, glowing softly with every measured movement. Their eyes shimmered like distant nebulae, beautiful, unreadable, ancient. They did not hurry. They never hurried. Everything about them spoke of time without consequence. Their posture carried no tension. Their gestures were deliberate, ceremonial. They observed humanity the way an astronomer observes a comet, beautiful, fleeting, and ultimately irrelevant. Later, we would understand why. The Thal'kyr were biologically immortal. Their cells regenerated flawlessly.
Their neural structures evolved for stability, not speed. Change came to them slowly, carefully, across centuries. Emotion was something to be balanced. Urgency was considered a flaw. To them, humanity was a curiosity, a brief flicker of life in a universe measured in eons. They recorded us with quiet interest, catalogued our wars, analyzed our art, measured our lifespan with faint, distant pity. Their historians worked in timelines longer than our entire recorded history. Their strategists planned outcomes across millennia. Their rulers debated policy in spans that exceeded the age of our nations. And because of that, they did not see the danger. They did not understand what it meant to live knowing the clock was always ticking. They did not understand how desperation sharpens thought, how fear accelerates innovation, how love and grief can become engines of evolution. In their eyes, we were eternal children, burning fast, feeling too much, dying too soon. They believed we would never grow up.
The first thing humanity misunderstood about the Thal'kyr was their calm. At a distance, it looked like confidence, wisdom earned through survival across ages, a serenity that suggested they had seen every possible outcome and already chosen the correct one. Many humans, especially in those early days, mistook that stillness for superiority. It wasn't. It was inertia. The Thal'kyr perceived time differently. Where humans experienced days as pressure and years as urgency, the Thal'kyr experienced decades as moments. Their neural architecture was designed for permanence. Change was filtered, softened, slowed. Sudden shifts were considered dangerous, destabilizing, something to be avoided until every variable had been examined across generations. This had kept them alive for millions of years. It had also made them predictable. Human analysts would later describe Thal'kyr decision-making as a form of strategic sedimentation, ideas layered slowly over time, compressing into doctrines so dense it resisted adaptation. Once a conclusion was reached, it became tradition. Once tradition formed, it became law. And once law existed, it was nearly impossible to challenge. Immortality did not free them from fear. It simply taught them to fear change more than extinction. They watched humanity with a detached interest of archivists. Every human action was logged, categorized, contextualized within evolutionary models built on species that rose and fell slowly. To the Thal'kyr, rapid change was statistical noise. Emotion was instability. Urgency was immaturity. Humanity's short lifespan baffled them. A species that lived mere decades seemed incapable of long-term planning. They concluded that humans survived not through intelligence, but through luck and adaptability, traits useful in the short term, but doomed in the long arc of cosmic history. They did not recognize adaptability as intelligence. Human observers noticed the delay almost immediately. Messages took too long to return. Decisions required layers of ritual consultation. Requests for clarification vanished into vast councils that would not reconvene for months. Where humans debated and acted within hours, the Thal'kyr paused, reflected, and postponed. To them, nothing was urgent. To humanity, everything was. There was a moment, quiet, unrecorded, when some human strategists began to feel an unfamiliar sensation. Not fear, not awe, opportunity. The realization crept in slowly, like a forbidden thought. The Thal'kyr were not ignoring humanity because they were stronger.
They were ignoring humanity because they could afford to wait. And waiting, humans knew, was a luxury only the immortal could survive. Mortality forces decisions. It compresses learning. It punishes hesitation. Humans had evolved under constant pressure, environmental collapse, internal conflict, extinction-level threats. We were a species forged in crisis. The Thal'kyr had never needed to hurry, and that meant they had never learned how. By the time the Thal'kyr councils reached their first formal conclusion about humanity, by the time eternity finished measuring its response, humans had already moved on to the next problem. And in that growing gap between their stillness and our speed, the future quietly began to tilt.
When the Thal'kyr finally acted, they did so gently. That should have been the warning. Earth at the time was still healing from the resource cataclysms. Coastal cities had been rebuilt higher. Energy grids had been redesigned around scarcity rather than abundance. Humanity was bruised, fragmented, but very much alive, humming with the restless urgency of a species that had survived its own worst impulses and refused to go quietly into extinction. Into that fragile recovery, the Thal'kyr introduced themselves not as conquerors, but as caretakers. Their emissaries arrived with ceremonial slowness, surrounded by fields of softly glowing energy that bent light rather than blocking it. Their presence radiated calm so profound it unsettled those who stood near them. Through layers of translators and symbolic projection, they conveyed their intention. Humanity would be observed, guided, and protected. The words sounded benevolent. The implication was not. Human leaders responded with careful diplomacy. They explained the cost of survival on a short timeline. They spoke of innovation born from necessity, of creativity forced by extinction-level pressure, of moral frameworks forged through failure rather than eternity. They tried to make the Thal'kyr understand that urgency was not recklessness, it was adaptation. The Thal'kyr listened patiently. Then they concluded with serene certainty that humanity misunderstood its own limitations. Their archivists had reviewed our wars, our collapses, our cycles of destruction and recovery. Their models predicted that left unchecked, humanity would burn itself out within a few thousand years, a tragic, preventable loss. In their eyes, intervention was not domination, it was responsibility. That was the first fracture. The second came quietly. Human orbital defense systems began to fail, not catastrophically, not violently, but subtly. Satellites slipped out of alignment, weapon platforms lost targeting autonomy, communications experienced minute delays that compounded into systemic vulnerability. Nothing exploded, no warning sounded. The Thal'kyr called these measures protection protocols. Their technology did not override human systems through force, it integrated. Organic code interfaced with digital architecture, wrapping around it like a living organism around a skeleton. Control was not seized, it was absorbed. Thal'kyr caretakers reassured human officials that these changes were temporary, necessary. They encouraged patience, trust. The pace of eternity, they suggested, was safer than the volatility of haste. Humans felt something tighten in their collective chest. To a species raised under constant deadlines, ecological collapse, political instability, resource depletion, the idea of surrendering agency, even temporarily, felt like suffocation. It was not the loss of weapons that frightened us, it was the loss of choice. Across Earth and its colonies, debates ignited. Some argued that submission ensured survival. Others warned that guardianship was merely conquest slowed to a crawl. The Thal'kyr did not intervene in these arguments. They watched, they recorded, they believed time would resolve dissent. They did not understand that humans, when pressured, do not settle. We fracture. And from those fractures, something sharper begins to form.
The resistance did not begin with gunfire. It began in quiet rooms filled with exhausted people who could not sleep. Engineers stared at malfunctioning schematics long after shifts ended. Linguists replayed alien transmissions frame by frame, listening not to the words but to the silences between them. Biologists dissected fragments of Thal'kyr organic technology with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. None of them called what they were doing rebellion. They called it understanding. The Thal'kyr were careful. Their systems were elegant, layered with redundancies refined over millennia. But humanity had learned long ago that complexity always hides assumptions, and assumptions are weaknesses waiting to be named. The first insight came from a human neuroscientist who noticed something strange in Thal'kyr interface protocols. Their control systems responded not just to logic, but to harmony. Emotional equilibrium was not a byproduct of their technology. It was a requirement. Thal'kyr ships were not piloted in the human sense. They were bonded, grown in tandem with their operators, synchronized through decades of neural calibration. The ships functioned best when their pilots maintained perfect emotional stasis. Calm was not a preference, it was infrastructure. Humanity possessed no such stillness. At first, the discovery seemed academic. Then an accident occurred. A human maintenance team was allowed aboard a Thal'kyr vessel under observation protocols. No weapons, no authority, just fragile mortals moving through living corridors of bone and light. One of them panicked in a confined space. Heart rate spiked. Cortisol flooded their system. The ship reacted. Lights flickered. Bioluminescent veins pulsed out of rhythm. Navigation harmonics destabilized. The Thal'kyr attendants corrected the imbalance within moments, but the data remained. Human emotion had disrupted an immortal machine. The second incident was no accident. Human researchers began testing proximity effects, exposure thresholds, emotional variance, rage, fear, grief, exhilaration, states humans cycled through in hours, sometimes minutes. Each fluctuation produced measurable interference in Thal'kyr systems. It was not strength, it was noise. And noise in a system designed for perfect harmony was catastrophic. Quiet networks formed beneath the surface of official cooperation. Encrypted channels carried theories that would have been dismissed as madness weeks earlier. Humanity was not technologically superior, not yet, but we were psychologically incompatible with their perfection. A human could step into a Thal'kyr environment carrying the weight of loss, trauma, and unprocessed fear, and that weight bent reality around them. Where the Thal'kyr had refined stillness into art, humans embodied chaos as instinct. The first victory came by accident. The second came by design. And with each whispered success, humanity began to understand a terrifying truth. The immortals had evolved away from disorder. We had evolved inside it.
Humanity did not celebrate the discovery. That came later, after necessity hardened curiosity into doctrine. At first, there was only unease, a creeping awareness that something fundamental separated us from the Thal'kyr, not just biologically, but existentially. Their technology was not merely advanced, it was dependent on a worldview humans could never inhabit. Stability was their oxygen, harmony was their foundation. Humans were storms pretending to be systems. Researchers began to map the phenomenon more rigorously. Emotional variance was quantified, categorized, and measured against Thal'kyr's system performance. The results were consistent and deeply unsettling. Elevated emotional states, especially unresolved ones, created cascading interference across Thal'kyr neural lattices. Fear spiked navigational error rates. Grief destabilized memory loops. Rage fractured command harmonics. Even joy, uncontrolled and intense, caused resonance feedback that their systems struggled to dampen. The Thal'kyr would later name this effect cognitive turbulence. To humanity, it felt like discovering a weapon made entirely of pain. There was no single breakthrough moment, no dramatic announcement. Instead, knowledge accumulated quietly, dangerously, across secure servers and sleepless nights. Humans had lived their entire history suppressing emotion in the name of order. Now they were learning that emotion, raw, unfiltered, volatile, could bend immortal infrastructure. The implications were horrifying. To weaponize this effect would require people to carry their trauma into battle, to focus fear, to sharpen grief, to step willingly into the worst moments of their lives and let those moments spill outward. Some refused outright. Others hesitated, knowing exactly what the cost would be. But the Thal'kyr continued tightening their protection protocols. Human autonomy shrank by degrees too small to trigger alarms, but too large to ignore. Choices were delayed. Authority was assisted. Entire systems waited for permissions that never came. Time was running out. Human engineers began experimenting with amplification fields, devices that did not create emotion but magnified what was already there. They were crude at first, unstable, dangerous to the user as much as the target. Early tests resulted in breakdowns, seizures, irreversible psychological damage. No one called it progress, but it worked. A single emotionally unstable human inside an amplification field could destabilize a Thal'kyr system kilometers away. A group, synchronized not through calm but through shared intent, could collapse entire subsystems. The Thal'kyr noticed anomalies, patterns that defied their models. They convened councils, requested more data, deliberated, as they always did. Humanity did not wait. The era of accidents was ending, the era of intention had begun, and somewhere in the dark, the first truly irreversible line was crossed, not by soldiers, but by people who understood that survival sometimes demands becoming something you were afraid of.
The moment that changed everything did not look like a weapon. It looked like a concession. A Thal'kyr relay ship drifted at the edge of human-controlled space, its presence announced as a gesture of cooperation, negotiation, reassessment. The kind of symbolic move the Thal'kyr favored when faced with uncertainty. Time, they believed, would smooth the edges of conflict. Humanity sent researchers, not soldiers, not politicians, scientists, analysts, cultural mediators, unarmed, mortal, visibly fragile. The Thal'kyr allowed it, confident in their protocols, certain that a handful of humans could not meaningfully threaten a structure grown and refined over thousands of years. Among them was a woman whose name history would later blur into anonymity. She had survived the resource wars. Her family had not. Years of unresolved grief lived inside her like a collapsed star, dense, invisible, and constantly pulling inward. She volunteered without explaining why. Perhaps she understood something the rest of us did not yet want to admit. When she stepped into the relay ship's core chamber, the air itself seemed to change. Thal'kyr ships were designed around equilibrium. The chamber glowed softly, its living walls pulsing in slow, synchronized rhythms. Attendants projected waves of tranquil neural resonance, maintaining perfect emotional harmony. Her presence shattered it. The amplification field was minimal, barely more than a prototype. It did not create grief. It simply gave it space. The moment her emotional focus sharpened, the ship reacted as if struck by a cosmic event. Bioluminescent veins flared out of pattern. Structural harmonics buckled. Navigation matrices desynchronized in cascading failures. The ship did not explode. It panicked. Thal'kyr attendants attempted to reassert calm, flooding the chamber with stabilizing projections. Their serenity folded under the weight of something they had never trained for: raw, unresolved human loss. Her grief was not loud. It did not rage. It endured. And endurance, it turned out, was something immortals had never learned to withstand. Systems shut down across the relay ship. Communication arrays collapsed into silence. The living structure trembled, not from damage, but from confusion. Its ancient design confronted with emotional intensity it had no framework to interpret. The human team barely escaped. In the aftermath, the Thal'kyr described the event using a term that would circulate through both civilizations like a warning: cognitive turbulence. A disruptive force born not of technology, but of psychology. To humanity, it was proof. Proof that immortality had a cost. Proof that serenity was not strength. Proof that the very traits humans had spent centuries trying to suppress, grief, fear, emotional instability, were capable of breaking systems older than our species. The woman survived. What she carried did not lessen, but the universe shifted around her. That single act, one human standing inside her pain, ended a millennium of Thal'kyr strategic certainty. Quiet networks erupted into action. Governments crossed lines they had sworn never to approach. The age of negotiation ended there. The age of survival began. Once the line was crossed, humanity moved with frightening speed. Research that would have taken decades under normal ethical constraints was compressed into months. Failures were accepted as inevitable. Casualties were mourned quickly, then folded into momentum. Humanity had always evolved this way, learning faster under pressure, adapting in the shadow of extinction. The Thal'kyr watched in disbelief. They attempted to respond with caution, convening councils to reassess their assumptions. They debated whether humanity's actions were an anomaly or an evolutionary deviation that would burn itself out. Their deliberations stretched across years. Humanity did not grant them that time. Amplification technologies were refined. Crude resonance fields became precise instruments capable of focusing specific emotional states. Panic could be shaped into shockwaves. Guilt, sharpened and sustained, could collapse memory lattices across entire Thal'kyr command networks. Courage, volatile, irrational, uniquely human, could overload organic processors designed for equilibrium. Each advancement came at a cost. Those who operated the systems carried the emotional weight long after battles ended. Trauma was not discharged, it was recycled. Soldiers were no longer defined by physical endurance, but by psychological resilience, the ability to carry unbearable feeling and remain functional. Humanity was becoming something harsher. The Thal'kyr attempted containment. Colonies were quarantined under the guise of protection. Access to shared infrastructure was restricted. Their strategies were methodical, ritualized, precise, and catastrophically slow. By the time a quarantine directive was finalized, humans had already rerouted supply lines. By the time sanctions were imposed, new technologies had rendered them irrelevant. Where the Thal'kyr responded to change, humanity anticipated it. The gap widened with terrifying momentum. Some humans began to question what they were becoming. Debates raged across planetary networks. Was survival worth the erosion of empathy? Was domination the inevitable outcome of adaptation? The questions were asked loudly, passionately, and without consensus. But action continued regardless. Because beneath every argument lay the same unspoken truth. If humanity slowed down, if it hesitated even briefly, the immortal empire would close around it like a patient tide. Speed was no longer a tactic. It was survival. The Thal'kyr finally recognized humanity as a threat, not because of military losses, but because of unpredictability. Their models failed. Their projections diverged wildly. Humanity did not stabilize into a pattern. It mutated too fast. An empire built on eternity could not compete with a species sprinting against its own mortality. And then, just as humanity began to believe it had learned the rules of this conflict, another presence entered the equation. Faster, sharper, hungrier. The universe, it seemed, was not finished testing us. The arrival of the Thal'kyr did not announce itself with silence. It came with violence. Their war clusters tore through the edge of known space like blades through fabric, fast, aggressive, unconcerned with ceremony. Where Thal'kyr ships drifted, the Thal'kyr lunged. Where immortals deliberated, predators acted. Their vessels were angular, chitin-plated constructs bristling with weaponry, engines flaring hot and bright like exposed muscle. The contrast was unmistakable. The Thal'kyr were not ancient philosophers. They were not caretakers or observers. They were hunters, an apex species forged by scarcity, competition, and relentless selection. Multi-limbed, mantis-like beings encased in dark exoskeletons, their movements were sharp, economical, lethal. Hierarchy governed every aspect of their culture. Strength was law. Dominance was truth. They despised the Thal'kyr. To the Thal'kyr, immortality without aggression was stagnation, a waste of evolutionary potential. They saw the Thal'kyr empire as bloated, slow, ripe for harvesting. Humanity, meanwhile, fascinated them. Humans were small, fragile, physically inferior, and yet dangerous. The Thal'kyr studied humanity with predatory curiosity. They observed how humans compensated for weakness with ingenuity, how they adapted under pressure, how they turned internal chaos into tactical advantage. Unlike the Thal'kyr, the Thal'kyr did not dismiss emotion as immaturity. They saw it as volatility. And volatility, in the hands of a desperate species, could explode in any direction. The Thal'kyr entered the conflict as opportunists, striking Thal'kyr assets while testing human defenses with probing assaults. Their attacks were swift, brutal, and efficient. No rituals, no warnings, just force applied at the weakest point until something broke. For the first time, humanity faced an enemy that did not wait. Human defenses buckled under the initial pressure. Thal'kyr strategies adapted in real time, countering emotional resonance attacks with dispersal tactics and aggressive disruption. Their warriors were conditioned for fear. Their minds were hardened against panic. But they were not immune. Human commanders realized quickly that this was no longer a war of patience versus speed. It was now a triangle of philosophies: eternal stillness, predatory dominance, and desperate adaptation. Humanity stood in the middle, and for the first time since first contact, there was no illusion of control, no clear advantage, only the raw, familiar sensation that had defined our entire history. We were being hunted, and as always, when cornered, humanity began to change, faster than anyone watching could fully comprehend. The Thal'kyr did not rush to destroy humanity. They studied us, captured sensor logs, intercepted transmissions, battlefield telemetry. Everything was dissected with ruthless efficiency. To the Thal'kyr, war was not chaos. It was data, and data revealed patterns, even in creatures as erratic as humans. They concluded, with near-unanimous certainty that humanity was unfinished. Not weak, not inferior, simply incomplete. Human bodies were inefficient. Human lifespans were absurdly short. Human emotions were unstable to the point of self-harm. To a species bred for optimization, this made no sense. And yet, humans endured, adapted, recovered faster than projections allowed. The Vetsi labeled us juveniles, children of evolution, dangerous not because of what we were, but because of what we might become if allowed to mature. They watched how humans responded to pressure, how losses did not break us, but accelerated us, how each defeat produced a flurry of innovation. New tactics, new technologies, new ways to weaponize what should have been liabilities. This unsettled them. The Thal'kyr, in contrast, continued to operate on known patterns. Their responses were consistent, their strategies refined but static. Against the Vetsi, they lost ground rapidly, not because they lacked power, but because they lacked adaptability. Humanity noticed something the Vetsi did not expect. The predators were faster than the immortals, but they were still bound by doctrine. Strength ruled their culture. Hierarchies shaped their thinking. Every tactic assumed dominance would decide the outcome. Humans had no such assumption. We had survived without dominance for most of our history. We had endured under empires, disasters, and extinction threats. Our instincts were not built around winning quickly. They were built around surviving at any cost. Human strategists began exploiting Vetsi certainty. Feigned retreats drew them into ambush zones. Emotional resonance attacks were altered, not to overwhelm, but to confuse. Inconsistency became a weapon. No pattern held long enough to be countered. The Vetsi adapted, but slower than humanity mutated. They began to realize that humanity's greatest strength was not technology, nor emotion, nor intelligence alone. It was the speed at which we abandoned yesterday's solutions without nostalgia. The Vetsi finally reached a conclusion that chilled even their hardened command structures. If humanity was allowed to continue evolving under pressure, it would not merely survive the conflict. It would outgrow it. And so, deep within their strategic cores, the predators made a decision, not born of fear, but of calculation. Children grow, and sometimes the only way to prevent that is to put them in chains early. The theory was never meant to leave the room. It emerged inside a Vetsi strategic analysis chamber, one of their deep interrogation and synthesis nodes, where captured data was not merely reviewed but digested, stripped of sentiment, and reduced to survival logic. Human observers would later reconstruct it from fragments, echoes, and leaked neural telemetry. The Vetsi strategist did not speak with contempt. He spoke with concern. Humanity, he argued, did not fit any known evolutionary endpoint. We were not specialized predators, not immortal observers, not static optimizers. Our biology, psychology, and culture were all in flux. Unfinished systems layered on top of one another, constantly rewritten by crisis. The strategist called us the eternal children. Not children as an insult, but as a stage. Children change rapidly. They learn without permission. They abandon failure without regret. Their minds reshape themselves under stress at speeds adults can no longer match. Evolution, the strategist concluded, had not finished with humanity yet. The Thal'kyr were the elder race, perfected, serene, trapped in equilibrium. The Vetsi were the warrior race, optimized, lethal, but rigid. Humanity was something else entirely. We were the becoming race, a species still sharpening itself. The strategist projected long-term simulations, hundreds of thousands of years compressed into predictive arcs. In every scenario where humanity survived sustained pressure, the result was the same. Humans eclipsed both empires, not through raw power, but through adaptability that never stabilized long enough to be countered. Given time, humanity would dominate. The room reportedly fell silent. Immortality could not match acceleration. Optimization could not match mutation. Eternity could not outpace desperation. The conclusion was cold, logical, and unanimous. Humanity must be controlled now, or enslaved, before maturation completed. That was their mistake, because the universe, chaotic as it is, rarely keeps secrets forever. Fragments of the analysis leaked through compromised channels. Human intelligence networks intercepted partial reconstructions. The theory spread quietly at first, then explosively across human space. We heard what they called us. We heard what they feared. And instead of recoiling, humanity did something uniquely, dangerously human. We believed it. The idea took root not as terror, but as purpose. If we were unfinished, then survival was not enough. Growth became imperative. Every sacrifice gained meaning. Every moral compromise was reframed as preparation. The prophecy the Thal'kyr tried to bury became humanity's mirror, and staring into it, we stopped asking whether we should change. We asked how fast. Belief can be a weapon. It can also be a wound. As the war escalated, the cost of humanity's acceleration became impossible to ignore. Emotional resonance weapons grew more precise, more devastating, and more intimate. Victory no longer required overwhelming force. It required people willing to open old scars and hold them open long enough to break something ancient. Cities argued with themselves, not with riots or revolutions, but with desperate urgency. Public networks filled with debates that lasted for days without resolution. Was survival worth psychological annihilation? Could a species remain humane while turning trauma into infrastructure? No answer satisfied everyone. Soldiers returned from deployments unable to disconnect from the emotional states they had been forced to sustain. Fear lingered like static in their nerves. Grief resurfaced uninvited. Some reported feeling empty, as if parts of themselves had been burned away to power machines they could not unsee. Medical systems struggled to adapt. Traditional treatments were inadequate for wounds inflicted not by violence, but by deliberate emotional excavation. Humanity had never fought a war where the battlefield existed inside the mind. The Thal'kyr, bound and pressured from multiple fronts, withdrew into increasingly defensive postures. Their once unshakable serenity began to fracture. Reports emerged of internal dissent, immortals struggling to reconcile their identity with the reality of fear. The Thal'kyr, meanwhile, grew more aggressive. Frustrated by humanity's refusal to collapse, they launched a decisive strike against the lunar colonies. It was swift, brutal, and calculated to break morale. Infrastructure was targeted. Civilian habitats were compromised. The message was clear: adapt faster or be erased. Humanity did not collapse. It unified, not through hope, but through fury tempered by clarity. Pain spread faster than panic. Grief synchronized across billions of minds, not as chaos, but as focus. Engineers, scientists, and tacticians abandoned incremental progress and crossed thresholds that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Captured Thal'kyr biotechnologies were integrated directly into human systems. Not copied, rewritten. Their calm neural architectures were forced to accommodate human volatility rather than suppress it. The result was unstable and revolutionary. Within weeks, humanity unveiled something new, not merely a weapon, but a framework, a way to turn emotional chaos into controlled force. They called it neuroflux. And with its birth, the war entered its final, irreversible phase. Neuroflux was not invented. It was forced into existence. Human engineers did not design it from first principles. They stitched it together from desperation, stolen alien biology, and an uncomfortable truth humanity could no longer ignore. Emotion was not a side effect of intelligence. It was a form of intelligence. Thal'kyr neural matrices were built to suppress variance, to smooth emotional spikes into harmonic calm. Human minds did the opposite. We spiked. We crashed. We adapted. Neuroflux emerged where those two architectures were violently fused. Calm frameworks repurposed to contain chaos instead of eliminating it. The early prototypes were lethal. Operators experienced sensory overload so intense it erased hours of memory. Some collapsed mid-link. their nervous systems unable to reconcile forced synchronization with millions of other emotional signatures. Humanity refined the system not by reducing intensity, but by learning how to ride it. Training shifted from discipline to self-awareness. Operators were taught to confront their worst memories, not suppress them, to catalog fear, to compartmentalize grief without extinguishing it. Emotional control no longer meant calm, it meant direction. Neuroflux fields expanded human emotional bandwidth outward, linking individuals into temporary cognitive constellations. Fear became a waveform. Resolve became structure. Shared intent replaced hierarchy. When activated, neuroflux did not overwhelm indiscriminately. It focused. Human pilots reported the sensation as standing at the center of a storm that obeyed thought. Chaos no longer tore systems apart randomly. It was shaped, aimed, released. Against the Vetsi, the effect was disorienting. Their hive-linked tactics fractured under conflicting emotional signals they had never evolved to filter. Against the Thal'kyr, it was catastrophic. Their calm-based neural architectures collapsed outright, unable to process intensity without dissociation. The battlefield changed overnight. Human fleets no longer relied on superior firepower. They weaponized presence. Entire sectors destabilized simply by human ships entering resonance range. The Immortals' greatest strength, their perfect internal balance, became a liability that could be shattered on command. But the price was visible. Neuroflux operators aged faster. Not biologically, but psychologically. They carried the weight of millions of synchronized emotions: terror, hope, grief, rage, and learned to let go without losing themselves. Some could not. Humanity accepted the losses with grim understanding. This was not a war meant to be survived cleanly. It was a war meant to be ended. And with neuroflux humming across human fleets, the universe began to feel something it had not felt in a very long time. Acceleration. Proxima Gate was silent before the storm. Not the silence of calm, but the tense, charged quiet that precedes the breaking of worlds. Human fleets aligned, their neuroflux conduits humming faintly in resonance with every heartbeat, every fear, every fragment of grief concentrated across billions of souls. It was not an army. It was a living organism, aware, adaptable, unstoppable. Above, Thal'kyr fleets drifted with deliberate inevitability. They arrived not to conquer, but to mediate. They carried the weight of millennia in their serene movements, believing time itself would protect them. To them, negotiation was still possible. To them, speed was irrelevant. The Vetsi, however, did not wait. Their warships struck first, spiking through the void like predatory shadows. Blades of light and energy tore through space with instinctive precision. Their multi-limbed commanders anticipated every defensive pattern. Humanity was cornered, outgunned, and under relentless assault. But cornered prey is often the most dangerous. Neuroflux pulsed. What followed could not be measured in conventional terms. Emotional resonance surged outward from human fleets as a tangible force. Fear focused, grief concentrated, hope sharpened into razor clarity. The Vetsi hives wavered under the assault, their predictive networks scrambling as conflicting signals ricocheted through every link. Warriors collapsed mid-strike, disoriented, unable to process the intensity of mortality concentrated in a species they had underestimated. The Thal'kyr felt it too. Their ancient, eternal minds, designed to remain unflappable across eons, trembled under the weight of human desperation. Systems collapsed from within. Veins of bioluminescence flickered erratically. Core chambers shuddered. Immortals, trained to exist without panic, experienced cognitive dissonance for the first time. Their serene calculations fractured like glass under impact. They had prepared for weapons, for firepower, for siege. They had never prepared for a storm of feeling. The battle raged with surreal intensity. Human ships moved like extensions of their operators' minds, weaving between destruction and chaos. Every volley, every pulse, Every maneuver was guided by emotion transduced into precise action. The Vetsiai fleets, powerful and agile, found themselves trapped within a current they could not anticipate, a rhythm they could not disrupt. The Thal'kyr, magnificent yet inertial, were frozen by their own hesitation, the very patience that had defined their civilization now a cage. By the end of the engagement, the battlefield lay shattered. The Vetsiai were broken. Hive cohesion had failed. Command structures were in disarray. Survivors retreated, scattered, reorganized under human oversight. The Thal'kyr were on their knees, not mortally wounded, but cognitively defeated. Immortal beings, once patient arbiters of cosmic balance, now bowed to a species that lived too briefly to understand fear, yet feared nothing. Humanity stood between two empires, the apex of the storm, unbroken, adaptive, and alive. We had achieved victory not because we were the strongest, but because we were the most determined. Because our mortality had driven us to evolve faster than any immortal could anticipate. And yet, even in triumph, there was weight. Operators staggered from neuroflux exhaustion. Cities and colonies reeled from the impact of systemic chaos. Humanity had conquered, but at the cost of innocence, of psychological comfort, of the simplicity that had once defined us. The universe, however, now recognized one undeniable truth. Mortals could change everything, and above Proxima Gate, humanity had just proven it. Victory did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with silence. In the aftermath of Proxima Gate, the universe seemed to pause, as if recalculating its assumptions. Human fleets held position, not out of caution, but out of exhaustion. Neuroflux networks were powered down one by one, their operators emerging older in ways no chronometer could measure. The Thal'kyr Empire did not collapse. It yielded. Immortal beings, once architects of galactic equilibrium, accepted a reality they had never prepared for: control without time. Their civilizations were not destroyed, but bound, placed under human strategic oversight. Decision-making authority was transferred. Expansion was frozen. Their eternal patience was repurposed into compliance. They were not enslaved through chains. They were enslaved through structure. The Vetsiai fared worse. Their culture of dominance left no room for negotiation. Hive clusters were dismantled. Command hierarchies were broken and reassembled under human governance. The predators who once hunted were now constrained, their aggression redirected into containment roles they despised but could not escape. Humanity ruled, not with ease, but with awareness. Across human space, reflection followed victory. Debates resurfaced, quieter now, heavier. What had been gained? What had been lost? Children grew up hearing stories not of heroes, but of operators who never slept properly again, of soldiers who carried entire wars inside their minds. Humanity had survived, but survival had changed us. The Thal'kyr scholars attempted to name what had happened. They struggled, as they always had, with paradox. How could a species so young, so short-lived, so emotionally volatile outpace civilizations refined over millions of years? The answer haunted them. Humans did not seek equilibrium. We sought meaning. Our mortality forced urgency. Our fragility demanded creativity. Our emotions, so often dismissed as flaws, had become engines of adaptation. Where immortals waited, humans acted. Where predators dominated, humans endured. The Thal'kyr finally understood the theory they had once rejected. Children are dangerous, not because they are weak, but because they are unfinished. Humanity was never meant to stabilize. We were meant to grow. And growth, unchecked, is terrifying. The paradox was complete. Humanity became the dominant force in the galaxy not despite our short lives, but because of them. Each generation inherited fear and hope compressed into decades. Each loss sharpened innovation. Each victory accelerated change. We would never become eternal, and we would never want to. As the galaxy settled into its new order, one truth remained undeniable. The universe was no longer ruled by those who lasted longest or struck hardest, or waited most patiently. It was ruled by those who changed fastest. And somewhere beyond the stars, civilizations yet unborn would one day look back and struggle to understand how a fragile, fleeting species reshaped eternity itself. They would call it many things: conquest, survival, evolution. Humanity would remember it differently, as the moment the child grew up and refused to stop growing.